The moment Lillian Hartley stepped off that stagecoach in June 1876, she realized the advertisement she'd answered in a Philadelphia newspaper had been nothing but a beautiful, calculated lie. As the dust of the trail choked her lungs, the ranch foreman's eyes didn't settle on her face with a greeting. Instead, they crawled over her frame like she was livestock being appraised at a Sunday auction. His first words weren't a welcome to the territory, they were a declaration of ownership. "You'll bunk with the field hands, girl. We need strong backs for the haying, not soft eastern hands that look like they've never seen a day of real work." But Lillian had survived too much tragedy back east to be broken by a Wyoming bully with a tobacco-stained sneer. She had crossed a continent chasing the promise of honest work, dignity, and a fresh start away from the ghosts of her past. She wouldn't surrender either without a fight. Welcome to Copper Hollow Ranch, a sprawling empire of timber and stone where one woman's refusal to be owned would ignite a revolution in respect, love, and power. Stay until the end to see how Lillian transforms a trap into a triumph. Hit that like button and comment which city or state you're watching from. I want to see just how far Lillian's story of resilience travels across the world today. The dust hadn't even begun to settle from the stagecoach wheels before Lillian understood the gravity of her mistake. She stood in the oppressive Wyoming heat, a single worn trunk sitting at her feet like a tombstone for her expectations. She watched the coach disappear into a shimmering haze of sagebrush and heat waves, feeling the vastness of the wilderness press in on her. The mountains in the distance rose like jagged, broken teeth against a sky so piercingly blue it felt aggressive. Everything here was immense, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to the careful plans of a 23-year-old woman who had spent her very last dollar on a ticket toward what she thought was a respectable household position for a refined lady. In the centennial year of 1876, the West was sold to Easterners as a land of golden opportunity. But as Lillian looked at the man standing before her, she realized she had been sold a fantasy. This wasn't a land of refinement. It was a land of raw, unfiltered survival, where the weak were swallowed by the shadows of the peaks. The man studying her from beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat was the antithesis of the refined employer she had expected. He was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, possessing the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from years of unchecked authority in a land without many laws. His shirt was open at the throat, revealing skin burned a deep, leathery bronze by the sun, and his boots were caked with a mixture of mud and manure that Lillian refused to identify. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp as he circled her. "And older. The advertisement said young." Lillian kept her spine as straight as a steel rod, drawing on the poise her mother had instilled in her despite their poverty. "I am 23, Mr. Briggs," she replied, her voice steady. "The advertisement specified someone of working age and sound character. I meet both requirements with ease." The man laughed, a harsh sound like rocks tumbling down a dry canyon. "Sound character? That's rich." He spat into the dirt near her trunk. "Name's Briggs. I'm foreman here. You'll answer to me and me alone." Lillian's stomach dropped as the reality of the deception took hold. "I was under the impression I would answer to Mrs. Mercer," she said carefully, trying to maintain a shred of the professional dignity she had brought from Philadelphia. "The advertisement specifically mentioned household management and assisting the lady of the house." Briggs cut her off with brutal, efficient coldness. "The old man doesn't involve himself in the hiring, and Mrs. Mercer's been dead 3 years. That's my domain now." His smile revealed teeth stained yellow by tobacco and neglect. "And what I need ain't some prissy girl misarranging flowers and dusting books. I need bodies in the fields. Haying season's upon us and we're short-handed. You can either pick up a scythe or you can starve." The weight of her situation felt like a physical blow. She had known the advertisement was somewhat vague, but in her desperation, she had told herself that household support meant cooking, cleaning, or mending, respectable, safe work. Not the grueling, dangerous labor of the fields alongside men who viewed her as an interloper. The threat landed exactly as Briggs had intended. Lillian had precisely 17 cents left in her reticule and no family to wire for help. Her father had drunk himself into an early grave, and her mother had followed 6 months later from what the doctors called exhaustion. But Lillian knew it was simply the surrender of a soul that had no more to give. The Philadelphia boarding house had kept her on as long as charity allowed, but eventually even the kindest hearts have limits. Wyoming was supposed to be her escape from the pitying looks of neighbors and the predatory marriage proposals from men who saw a desperate woman and smelled an opportunity for a servant wife. Instead, she had traded one trap for another. "The advertisement promised," she began, but Briggs stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the sour scent of whiskey and stale sweat. "You got a problem with honest work, Miss Hartley, because there's the road. No one's forcing you to stay. But the next town is 15 miles north, and the wolves outnumber the people." Lillian looked at the road. It stretched empty and endless, disappearing into a horizon of heat shimmers and sage. She had no horse, no water, and no illusions about her chances of survival in this brutal landscape. She looked back at Briggs and saw exactly what he expected to see: submission and defeat. But as she stood there, something sharp and cold settled in her chest. She had spent her entire life being pushed into corners by men who assumed her desperation made her pliable. Her father had assumed it. The landlord back in Philly had assumed it, and now Briggs was banking on it. She was done rewarding their assumptions. "I'll need to see the living quarters first," she said, her voice level and devoid of the fear she felt. "And I expect the terms of my employment in writing, including the pay rate, hours, and specific duties." Briggs blinked, surprise momentarily cracking through his mask of confidence. Then his face darkened with a simmering rage. "You'll see what I tell you to see, and you'll do what I tell you to do. That's the only terms you need to know." "Then we have a problem," Lillian said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, "because I don't work under conditions I haven't reviewed. I am a citizen with rights, even in the Wyoming territory." Briggs's hand moved toward his belt, a gesture of intimidation that made Lillian's breath catch. She realized she might have pushed too far, miscalculating the volatility of a man used to being a king on a 1,000-acre ranch. But before the tension could snap, a new voice cut across the yard like a splash of cold mountain water. "Is there a problem here, Briggs?" Lillian turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the main house. He was younger than the foreman, perhaps 30, with dark hair and the kind of lean, rangy build that came from real physical toil rather than the supervisory bluster Briggs displayed. He moved with a quiet, grounded purpose, his eyes sharp and observant beneath the brim of a well-maintained hat. This was Cole Mercer, and with his arrival, the power dynamic of Copper Hollow Ranch began its first irreversible shift. Cole Mercer's presence was a stark contrast to the foreman's looming aggression. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, a man who occupied his space with a grounded authority that didn't require diminishing others to feel powerful. Briggs's tone shifted instantly, a greasy kind of subservience masking his irritation as he stepped back. "Just getting the new hand settled, Mr. Mercer. She's got a bit of a temper, this one." Cole's gaze moved to Lillian, and for the first time since she had crossed the Mississippi, she felt seen as a human being rather than a problem to be managed. "She has a name, Briggs," Cole said quietly, his voice cutting through the foreman's bluster. Lillian managed a nod, her heart still hammering against her ribs. "I am Lillian Hartley, sir, and I was under the impression I was hired for household management, not field labor." Cole observed her for a long moment, noting the dust-streaked face and the fire in her eyes that even exhaustion couldn't quench. "You look unsettled, Miss Hartley," he observed, his phrasing careful, giving her the room to speak without forcing a direct confrontation in front of the foreman. He picked up her trunk with an ease that spoke of functional strength and gestured toward the house. "Let's get you away from the dust. We'll discuss what's actually available and what you're actually willing to do." The main house at Copper Hollow was built from local timber and river stone, a structure that felt more like a fortress against the elements than a home. Inside, the temperature dropped significantly, the thick walls holding the cool of the morning. Cole led her into a mudroom where boots stood in military-like rows, then into a kitchen that smelled of rendered fat, coffee, and cedar. There Lillian met Violet Hollis, Cole's aunt and the true anchor of the ranch's domestic life. Violet was a woman of 60, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen every hardship the frontier could throw at a person. "Cole says Briggs tried to pull a fast one on you," Violet said, her voice blunt and refreshing. She handed Lillian a damp cloth for her face. "He's desperate for help in the fields, but that don't excuse a lie. The ad went out under my name, and I meant what I wrote. But you should know, Miss Hartley, Household work out here isn't about embroidery and tea. In 1876, it's about feeding 20 hungry men, managing a garden that wants to die every Tuesday, and keeping the books for a business that spreads across 10,000 acres of rugged terrain. If you're looking for a drawing room, you've come to the wrong territory. But if you're looking for a place where your mind matters as much as your hands, we might have a position for you. Lillian sat on a sturdy wooden bench, her hands trembling as she wiped away the Wyoming dust. She looked at Violet, and then at Cole, who remained by the door, watching her with a curious, unreadable expression. "In Philadelphia, I kept the books for my father's apothecary shop," Lillian said, her voice gaining strength. "I can cipher, I can organize chaos, and I can stretch $1 until it groans. I'm adequate at cooking, but I am exceptional with numbers. If your ranch is like most, you're losing money in places you haven't even looked yet." Violet's eyebrows shot up, and a small, appreciative smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Exceptional with numbers, eh? Cole, the girl might be a godsend. You've been complaining about those ledgers for months." Cole stepped forward, leaning against the heavy oak table. "The books are a mess," he admitted. "Since my mother passed, we've focused on the cattle and the horses, letting the paperwork pile up in the office. If you can truly organize that bachelor chaos and tell us exactly where every cent is going, you'll be worth twice what we're paying you. But be warned, Miss Hartley. Looking into the books is like looking under a rock. You might not like what you find crawling underneath." Her workspace was a small wood-paneled office off the main hall, a room that smelled of old ink and stale tobacco. It was a disaster area of 1870s record-keeping. Scraps of paper were shoved into drawers, invoices were stained with coffee and grease, and the main ledger was 3 months behind. Lillian spent her first week in a state of focused immersion, sorting through the remnants of the ranch's financial history. She realized quickly that Copper Hollow was a profitable operation on paper, but the actual cash flow was strangely sluggish. As she began to cross-reference purchase orders for grain and lumber with the actual receipts of payment, a pattern began to emerge, a subtle, jagged line of discrepancies. In an era where a rancher's word was often his bond, a shipment of fence posts would be recorded at one price, but the payout would be 10% higher. A bill for winter feed would list 50 bags, but the payment would cover 60. Each error was small, almost invisible in isolation, but together they formed a steady leak of wealth. Every single one of these suspicious transactions bore the bold, sloppy signature of Briggs. The deeper Lillian dug, the more the errors shifted from clerical mistakes to deliberate theft. She found records for ghost workers, names on the payroll that never appeared in the bunkhouse logs or the supply requisitions. She calculated that over the last 3 years, the ranch had lost nearly $8,000, a staggering sum in 1876, equivalent to nearly $250,000 in today's purchasing power. This was enough to buy a small herd or weather a devastating drought. The weight of this discovery sat heavy in her stomach. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the betrayal of trust. The Mercers had left the boring parts of the business to a man they believed was loyal, and he had spent that time carving out a fortune for himself at their expense. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Cole knocked on the office door. "Violet says you've been in here for 12 hours, he said, gesturing toward the stacks of paper. "The mountains are gold right now, Lillian. You need to breathe something other than dust." He led her outside to a fence line overlooking the valley, the air cooling rapidly as the shadows lengthened. "My mother used to say the sky out here was too big to hold," he said quietly. "Does it feel that way to you?" Lillian leaned against the rough-hewn fence, the vastness of the Wyoming range finally feeling less like a threat and more like a promise. "It feels honest," she replied, looking at Cole. "The landscape doesn't hide what it is. I wish I could say the same for the people on it." Cole's expression sharpened. "You found something in the books." Lillian hesitated, then nodded. "I found a pattern of deception that's been running for a long time. It's systematic, Cole. It's not just a few missed cents here and there. It's a calculated drain on your family's legacy." She explained the discrepancies, the ghost workers, and the inflated invoices, watching as Cole's face darkened into a mask of cold, controlled fury. "I knew Briggs was a bully," Cole said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I didn't think he was a thief. My mother trusted him. That's what's going to hurt my father the most." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the dying light of the sunset. "You've put yourself in a dangerous position, Lillian. Briggs is respected by the men, and he's been here a long time. Exposing him won't just be an audit, it will be a war. Are you sure you're ready for the fallout? Lillian looked at her hands, still stained with ink from the ledgers. I didn't come 2,000 miles to be safe, she said. I came to be free. And you can't be free if you're living a lie or letting someone else steal your future. The conviction in her voice seemed to surprise him, and for a moment, the distance between the rancher's son and the hired girl felt smaller than the sagebrush between them. I'll stand by you, Cole promised, his voice low and sincere. But we have to be smart. My father won't take an accusation lightly, and Briggs won't go quietly. We need the evidence to be airtight, something that even the most loyal hand can't deny. As they walked back to the house under a canopy of emerging stars, Lillian felt a strange, budding sense of belonging. The beautiful lie of the advertisement had led her to a harsh reality, but in that reality, she had found a purpose she never had in the drawing rooms of the East. She was no longer just a woman looking for a job, she was the guardian of Copper Hollow's truth. And as the night wind whispered through the pines, she knew that the real fight was only just beginning. The air in Samuel Mercer's study was thick with the scent of old leather, gun oil, and the impending storm of a confrontation 3 years in the making. Lillian sat across from the ranch patriarch, her fingers tracing the edges of the report she had meticulously compiled over 14 days of grueling, candlelit labor. In 1876, accounting wasn't just about math, it was about narrative, telling the story of where a man's sweat and blood had been converted into gold, or in this case, stolen away by a parasite. She had cross-referenced the 1875 cattle drive receipts against the local bank's deposit logs and found the leak was even worse than she had first suspected. Samuel Mercer, a man whose face was a map of Wyoming's harsh winters, watched her with a skepticism that bordered on hostility. He was a pioneer who believed in handshakes and the word of a man who had ridden with him through blizzards. To him, Lillian was an outsider, a city girl with ink on her thumbs, challenging the loyalty of his most trusted lieutenant. She knew that if her numbers wavered even slightly, she would be on the next stagecoach east, her reputation in tatters and her future extinguished. The moment of truth arrived when Briggs was summoned to the study, his spurs jingling with a confidence that felt like an insult. He stood by the window, his posture radiating the arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable. Briggs, Miss Hartley has brought some serious discrepancies to my attention, Samuel began, his voice a low growl that signaled trouble. Lillian didn't flinch. She laid out the invoices for the fictitious ghost workers, men like Silas Vance and Caleb Thorne, who appeared on the payroll every month but had no footprint in the local general store or the bunkhouse logs. She showed the inflated lumber prices from the sawmill in Cheyenne, comparing them to the market rates published in the Territorial Gazette. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted from skeptical to glacial. Briggs's confidence began to rot into a desperate, defensive rage. He didn't argue the numbers, he couldn't, so he attacked the source. You're taking the word of a drifter? A girl who probably fabricated this whole mess to keep herself from having to break a sweat in the sun? But Samuel wasn't looking at Briggs's face anymore. He was looking at the bold, sloppy signatures on the checks that matched the names Lillian had flagged. The fallout was instantaneous and violent in its silence. Samuel Mercer didn't shout. He simply told Briggs to clear his cabin by noon. But as the foreman stormed out, the ranch was sliced in two. In the hierarchy of a 19th-century cattle operation, the foreman was the bridge between the owner and the laborers. By removing Briggs, Lillian had inadvertently declared war on the social order of Copper Hollow. By sunset, 6 hands had quit in solidarity, tossing their gear into wagons and cursing Lillian's name as they rode toward the horizon. They didn't care about the theft. They cared about the perceived betrayal of one of their own by a woman who hadn't earned her stripes in the dirt. Those who remained moved with a stiff, cold efficiency, their eyes following Lillian with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. She had become an island on the ranch she was trying to save. Every meal in the dining hall felt like a trial, with the clink of silverware sounding like the cocking of a hammer. She realized then that uncovering the truth was only half the battle. Surviving the truth was going to require a different kind of strength altogether. Fearing for her safety as tensions boiled over in the bunkhouses, Cole took a step that further complicated Lillian's standing. He assigned Thomas Weaver, a steady, soft-spoken hand with a reputation for fairness, to act as her shadow whenever she crossed the yard. In the Victorian social codes that still lingered even on the frontier, this was a necessary precaution, but to the disgruntled hands, it looked like favoritism. Lillian chafed under the protection, her independent spirit bridling at the need for a guard. Yet she couldn't deny the chill that ran down her spine when she saw the remaining Briggs loyalists whispering in the shadows of the barn. Cole, meanwhile, stepped into the role of acting foreman, working 18-hour days to fill the vacuum left by the exodus. She would see him at dawn, his face shadowed by fatigue, and again at midnight, his boots caked in the dust of the north pasture. The shared burden of the ranch's survival began to weave an invisible thread between them, a bond forged not in the easy light of a parlor, but in the trenches of a business under siege. They were no longer just employer and employee. They were co-conspirators in a revolution of transparency. As the second month of her tenure drew to a close, Lillian realized that her presence at Copper Hollow had ignited something far larger than a financial audit. She had challenged the fundamental assumption that a woman's value was limited to her domestic utility. By proving that her intellect was the ranch's most potent weapon, she had disrupted a century of tradition. Yet, the victory felt hollow in the quiet of her small room at night. She was the most powerful person on the ranch's books, but perhaps the most hated person in its pastures. The revolution in respect she had hoped for was currently a cold war of glares and hushed conversations. She sat by her window, looking out at the vast, indifferent Wyoming stars, wondering if she had traded her 17 cents for a life of dignified isolation. But then she remembered the way Cole had looked at her when she stood her ground against Briggs, a look that held no pity, only a raw, burgeoning respect that felt more like home than any drawing room in Philadelphia ever could. The stage was set for the next chapter, a public trial of their characters that would determine if Copper Hollow would rise as a new kind of empire. As the golden leaves of the cottonwoods began to blanket the riverbanks in September 1876, the tension at Copper Hollow shifted from the internal struggle of the ranch to the unforgiving court of public opinion in the nearby town. In the 19th century West, news traveled faster than a fresh horse, and the story of the Philadelphia auditor who had dismantled the legacy of a veteran foreman was being retold at every bar and boarding house table. The whispers were jagged and unkind. They painted Lillian not as a woman of integrity, but as a cunning opportunist who had tricked the Mercer family to secure a comfortable life. This was the trial of character, a period where every glance Lillian exchanged with Cole and every dollar she saved the ranch was scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. For Lillian, the stakes were no longer just about her job. They were about her right to exist in this society without being branded a villain. She realized that in a world without many laws, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered, and hers was currently being devalued by people who had never even spoken her name. The pressure reached a boiling point when Cole proposed they attend the harvest dance at the town's communal hall. In 1876, a public appearance at such an event was the equivalent of a formal declaration of intent. It was honorable courtship in its most visible form, a tradition designed to bring private affections into the light of social scrutiny. Cole was adamant that they should not hide. "If we stay behind the fences of Copper Hollow, the rumors will only grow teeth," he told her one evening as the first frost began to sparkle on the windows. "We need to show them that our alliance isn't a secret or a scheme. It's a partnership of equals." Lillian understood the risk. If she failed to navigate the social minefield of the dance, she would confirm every ugly rumor circulating in the territory. But if she succeeded, she would do more than just defend her own honor. She would pave the way for a new kind of respect for women in the West. She decided that if the town wanted a show, she would give them one defined by poise, intelligence, and an unbreakable spirit. Lillian's preparation for the dance was a strategic operation. She worked with Violet to alter a dress of deep forest green wool, a garment that was practical enough for the frontier, but possessed a refined silhouette that whispered of her Eastern upbringing. In an era where a woman's attire was a complex language of status and morality, every stitch was a statement of self-worth. Violet, usually a woman of few words, became an unexpected mentor in the art of social warfare. "The women in town will look for a crack in your armor," Violet warned as she helped Lillian pin her hair into a softer, more elegant style than her usual work bun. "They expect you to be either a servant or a queen. Don't be either. Just be the woman who knows her own value, and the rest will follow." As Lillian looked into the small, cracked mirror, She didn't see the desperate girl who had arrived with 17 cents in her pocket. She saw a woman who had survived a war of numbers and was now ready to survive a war of whispers. The entrance into the town hall was a moment of profound, suspended animation. As the fiddle music slowed and the heat of dozens of lamps pressed against her skin, Lillian felt the weight of 100 gazes. Cole stood beside her, his hand firm on her arm, his own reputation as the heir to the territory's most successful ranch acting as a shield. They were a vision of the New West, a combination of old-world dignity and frontier resilience. The social siege began almost immediately. Mrs. Thornton, the wife of a prominent local land speculator, led a group of women who approached Lillian with the kind of predatory politeness that defines high-stakes social circles. They asked pointed questions about her methods of accounting and her influence over the Mercer men. Lillian didn't falter. She spoke of the importance of transparency in business and the necessity of integrity in all relationships, whether professional or personal. She didn't apologize for her competence. She treated it as a matter of fact, slowly turning the tide of the conversation from interrogation to a grudging, wary respect. By the time the final waltz was announced, the atmosphere in the hall had undergone a subtle but undeniable transformation. The trial of character hadn't ended in a conviction. It had ended in a hung jury, which was the greatest victory Lillian could have hoped for. People were no longer just talking about her schemes. They were talking about her sharp wit and her unwavering composure under fire. As she danced with Cole, the fiddle music swirling around them like the Wyoming wind, she realized that they had successfully navigated the first major external threat to their future. The public courtship was now a matter of record, and the territory had seen that the Mercers were not being tricked. They were being strengthened. But as they rode back to the ranch under a moon so bright it turned the sagebrush to silver, Lillian knew that the final part of her journey would require more than just social poise. It would require a total transformation of the power structure at Copper Hollow to ensure that the revolution of respect she had started would outlive the gossip of the town. By November 1876, the first true blizzard of the season had swept across the Wyoming plains, burying the sagebrush in a pristine, crystalline white. But inside the main house of Copper Hollow, the atmosphere was one of unprecedented stability. The revolution of transparency was complete. The leak in the accounts had been plugged, and for the first time in years, the ranch was operating with a significant financial surplus. Samuel Mercer, once the fiercest skeptic of Lillian's Eastern methods, had come to rely on her weekly reports. With the same regularity, he checked the weather or the health of his herd. In a time when women were often legally invisible in business matters, Samuel took a radical step that sent ripples through the territory's legal and social circles. He didn't just give Lillian a seat at the table, he formally recognized her as the ranch's chief administrator. In 1876, Wyoming was already a pioneer in women's rights, having granted women the right to vote in 1869, but social reality often lagged behind the law. At Copper Hollow, the social code was being rewritten by a woman with a pen and a man with the vision to let her use it. The beautiful lie that had brought Lillian west had been replaced by a brutal truth that made her indispensable to the territory's future. The transition from a professional partnership to a shared life reached its peak on a quiet evening in the barn, as the smell of fresh hay and wood smoke filled the air. Cole found Lillian reviewing the winter feed projections, her face illuminated by the warm, flickering amber of a lantern. There was no grand ceremony in his approach, just the quiet, grounded sincerity that had first drawn her to him. He didn't offer her a life of ease or a rescue from the world. He offered her a permanent stake in the future they had rescued together. "I don't want a wife to manage my home, Lillian," he said, his voice steady against the howling wind outside. "I want a partner to build an empire. I want your name next to mine on the deeds, on the contracts, and on the gate of this ranch." This was the ultimate revolution in power. It wasn't just a marriage proposal, it was a merger of equals. He handed her a ring, not a delicate filigree from a Philadelphia jeweler, but a sturdy band of Wyoming gold. In that moment, Lillian realized she wasn't just finding a husband, she was claiming a legacy. She said yes, not out of a need for safety, but out of a desire for a shared destiny in a land that rewarded the bold. The wedding, held in the spring of 1877 as the snow began to retreat into the high mountain peaks, was more than a social event. It was a cultural turning point. The guests included the skeptical ranchers and townspeople who had once whispered in the shadows, now forced to acknowledge the undeniable success of the Mercer-Hartley alliance. Margaret Caldwell, the formidable cattle queen of Montana, traveled down to act as a witness, her presence a silent endorsement that silenced any remaining dissent. The ceremony took place in the valley, under a sky so vast it seemed to bless the union of two people who had weathered a storm of gossip. Lillian didn't wear lace or silk. She wore a dress of fine forest wool that spoke of her new life, a blend of dignity and durability. As they exchanged vows, the revolution in respect reached its zenith. The territory saw that a woman could be a bookkeeper, an administrator, a wife, and a leader all at once. Copper Hollow became the blueprint for a new kind of Western operation, one where efficiency was driven by intellect and authority was earned through merit rather than tradition. The rumors of Lillian's calculation had been defeated by the undeniable reality of her massive contribution to the ranch's survival. 5 years later, the dust and desperation of 1876 were a distant memory, but the foundations Lillian had laid remained unshakable. Copper Hollow had expanded, absorbing 2 neighboring tracts of land and establishing a horse breeding program that was the envy of the Northwest. Lillian stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, her young daughter playing in the grass and her infant son asleep in a cradle she had helped design for practicality. She looked at her hands, no longer just stained with ink, but calloused from the work of a life she had chosen with clear eyes. She had arrived with 17 cents and a trunk full of expectations, and she had transformed them into a stake in a 10,000-acre dream. The beautiful lie of the advertisement had indeed been a lie, but it had been the catalyst for a much larger truth. She had proven that in the American West, the only limits were the ones you allowed others to place on you. She had moved from a woman seeking a job to a woman who provided them, shaping the economic and social landscape of a young territory with every ledger entry and every strategic decision she made alongside her husband. As we close the book on Lillian Hartley's incredible journey, we are reminded that history isn't just made by generals and politicians, it's made by people like Lillian who refuse to accept the baskets society tries to put them in. Her story is a testament to the power of competence, the necessity of integrity, and the beauty of a partnership built on mutual respect. Lillian didn't just survive the challenges of Copper Hollow. She revolutionized the very idea of what a ranch could be. She took a trap and turned it into a triumph, leaving a legacy that would inspire generations of women to demand a seat at the table of power. Stay curious about the stories of the unsung heroes of the frontier, for they are the ones who truly built the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Lillian's revolution, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of resilience and power from the heart of history. I want to hear from you in the comments. What part of Lillian's grit inspired you the most? Thank you for watching until the very end, where the dust settles and the truth remains. Until next time, stay brave, stay honest, and keep reaching for the horizon.